It's my privilege to introduce our guests today, Doctors Amy Vecchione and Will Hughes of Boise State University. Amy works in the library. Will is not only part of the material science program here at Boise State, he's now the Assistant Dean of the College of Innovation and Design. So, how does a university begin figuring out what it might look like in the future? Amy and Will are here to discuss their work in a university wide process for envisioning Boise State in 2020. During our time together, they will describe the Vision 2020 opportunity, why and how they created personas, why and how they created prototype templates, how their personas and templates interacted. They'll share their lessons learned, and they'll also answer your questions. Amy and Will, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. This is great.
So, hi everybody. My name is Will Hughes. As Steve mentioned, I'm in the Material Science and Engineering Department, and really that's my home for scholarship, but also embedded within the College of Innovation and Design, where we are building and launching a new college in real time. We're in our second semester, and part of the objective for the college is to help bring relevancy to Boise State during a time of inflection in higher education, and specifically, how do we increase new pathways of learning for our students here at Boise State. Okay, now we ended up engaging in a process that we called Boise State 2020. 2020 was chosen both for year and in vision, so 2020 vision, 2020 the year. The reason that the date was also picked was because of this idea that there's kind of a movement in higher ed right now relative to hollowing out of almost like the middle class of a lot of state institutions. And so what we're starting to see is schools that may be like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Caltech, Georgia Tech, University of Michigan, and so forth. These schools have a elite opportunity and elite experience that they provide to many of their students. They also are very much endowment empowered institutions. Okay. Now on the other side, there's a movement in disruptive technologies such as this that's going on right now, as far as new ways of learning that are very efficient and very economical, right? And as a consequence, it starts to question at the middle class, if you will. Okay, if the middle class is deemed as stability on a national level, a middle class as how do we promote stability and not hollow it out? Well, one way is that if you're being pulled towards an elite like experience or going towards a budget experience, what happens towards this middle class? And for Boise State, we're kind of well positioned right there, which is both an exciting and a tenuous situation to be in relative to some of the trends that we're seeing. There are institutions that are opening, there's institutions that are closing across the nation. That's not necessarily going to change. There's also this trend in higher ed where for a lot of state institutions, state budgets are reducing. And as a consequence, it's asking to do more with less in some ways. And then in addition, federal funding, if you will, is becoming more difficult to secure because it's becoming a more competitive process. I tend to say that for a lot of grant-like activity, it's equivalent to gambling because the odds are worse than Vegas for a lot of scientists and educators. And as a consequence, you have to think about what does it mean to be an enterprise in today's world, and how do you sustain the mission of being a state institution while also embodying the empowerment of an enterprise organization. And the College of Innovation and Design is well positioned right at the juxtaposition of those two things. And we're here to help envision and dream what the future could be, as well as help deliver on that dream for Boise State. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a primer. Now, going to the event, part of it was to say, okay, because of maybe some of these trends that are occurring in higher ed and the temporal component affiliated with it, then within the context of recognizing that in the next 5 years or so, we may actually have a new president at Boise State. This is really a very good time to empower our faculty, specifically in our administration, to be thinking, where do we want to go, right? And why do we want to go there? And as a consequence, in collaboration with Amy, as well as Diego Rodriguez at IDEO. He's one of the founders of IDEO. He's also a faculty at the Stanford D School and a resident faculty at the Harvard Business School. And now, I guess, a faculty in practice here at Boise State University. So he's busy. But the three of us ended up envisioning and casting visions for what the future could look like. And as a consequence, we generated, I think it was 8 futures, and these are prospective futures that started almost like we could do this today, to aspirational goals that were very far away that some people may say, hey, that's not even possible, but we kind of have some indication that it is possible because there's models of success internationally on some of them. And then there's this other component, which is, okay, well, we have these futures. It's a way of framing kind of a design experience within this Boise State 2020 event where you have teams of faculty, administration, and some students that are partnering together on a design challenge, okay? Now that design challenge was to create a signature experience for the future that was given, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, give a couple of examples. Now, relative to that future, each of the participants had to take on a persona, which is what we're really going to be talking about. Okay, now those personas were all student personas, and these were created through the leadership of Amy in collaboration with me, as far as how do we capture the voice, capture the identity, capture the values, the purpose, the mission, the challenges, the constraints of our student body. Okay, and we're going to walk you through each one of those personas and then hopefully share some background on how did we arrive at them. And feel free at any point to just jump on in and say, hey, why did you do that? Or how does that fit within the context of that future? And what hopefully will also come across is that each one of the features that will be presented, there was a lead persona that was built in collaboration with that future. Whereas other students, of course, could participate in that future, but we were almost like segmenting the market, if you will, at some level. And so that's just a brief opening, and on to slide 2, no, 3. Okay, slide 3,
which is the one that we're on. And well, when you talk about these futures, I feel like it would be helpful for them to know that there were more futures than what we had or what you had derived or created. Specifically, so you know that some were cut off for the event, just so that they know it's always a work in progress, right?
Yep.
And when you go live with something, you just have to kind of get rid of the things that aren't going to work out for that particular event. So there were 9. There were actually more than 9 that
Yep.
you had lined up, but we went with 8 because they were the most fleshed out, right?
Yep. And so maybe, so my response to that is that given the context of the timing, which was a half-day event, how do you drive as much contrast between the futures and as much contrast to the personas
Right.
as you can without being exhaustive in the process? Because you can actually devolve the outcomes if you provide too many opportunities for people to envision. It becomes too complex to engage in.
So there were a lot of constraints that
Yep.
we worked with on, and that was all purposeful. So the first one is lifelong university.
Yeah, yep. So the first university, and hopefully you all see it at slide 3, is lifelong university. And the goal here was to, in some ways, to envision 2 things. One is there are a lot of non-traditional students here at Boise State University. And in addition, this idea of education occurring in only 4 years is very constraining. And the relationship building that occurs only over 4 years is also relationship constraining. There's also a movement nationally where after you leave college, within this block of time, okay, that you participated, there tends to be this courtship for the rest of your life for a lot of institutions, for alumni, right? Helping build that community, but in a way of actually giving back to the community financially. And there was a personal orientation for lifelong learning or lifelong university that was like, how do you build a lifelong relationship where value exchange is not just writing a check to the institution? And so could you envision a place where students could come as a freshman or as a single mom, as an example, working a job at Micron, and be able to engage, or working in a startup environment, be able to come and go within the institution? And so this idea of almost a hierarchical structure from faculty to, let's say, research faculty, to postdocs, to students, you're actually eroding that, and you're planarizing the system to just say that everyone that's engaging at, let's say, the future of Boise State, this lifelong university, is a member of Boise State. And you may begin as a student, but you could easily circle back and become an instructor. You could easily circle back relative to becoming a faculty. And so there was intended to be inherent flexibility built into the system to accommodate people's lives as they develop is the most important thing. And then as those individuals develop, you weave them back into the fold of the system, okay, based on life experiences, and you leverage those life experiences for the benefit of the community that you're building. So that was an example of lifelong university, and you have some things to add?
There's a question about what is a persona and why did you decide to use them, which I feel like we can just throw in here right now, which is each one of these futures, like Will said, has a specific group or market segment of the undergraduate, graduate, and other type of student population that would have been really closely affiliated with this type of university. So lifelong university would be really closely affiliated with Olivia, I think was the primary.
Yep. And then Jason, Joaquin, and Kristen.
Yeah, so there were 4 personas, and the personas really represent these user groups that would be most interested in this type of university. That doesn't mean it wouldn't benefit all of our personas, but our personas that we'll introduce you to in a little bit will, it'll make clearer how they're married to these particular future types. I'll try to advance. Let's see what happens. Otherwise, I'll have Steve do the next one. Go to slide 4.
And is that modular?
It is modular. I'll bring it up right here too, so we can see it on the other screen.
Okay. And so for Modular University, this is also an empowerment move, but an empowerment move for students that want to create their own identity, but having enough scaffolding in place where that identity doesn't necessarily get lost, as an example. So you can think about building learning experiences that are almost like bricks. As the schematic shows, they can be stacked in a whole array of ways. And as a consequence, you're able to represent yourself through your learning. But at the same time, they are structurally aligned to one another so that there's an efficiency from you getting from the beginning to the end of your educational process. The premier student for this was Kristen, who we'll describe in a minute. And just to keep on with Amy's orientation, other students attracted to the model are Jason, Joaquin, and Katie. And so there are a series, well, let me say this. Why was this, sorry, I'm leaning forward into the screen. Why was this chosen as not necessarily a near-term goal, but maybe moving towards a slight aspirational state? Is that here at Boise State, we have a interdisciplinary program that's multidisciplinary studies. And as a consequence, you have all these courses, right? And all these courses can be aggregated in a host of ways, specifically focused on the humanities, but they could be broader than that. We're seeing as a consequence of a lot of millennials engaging with the institution, this identity of self-expression. Self-expression infuses into a lot of things in the world, including what does it mean to be yourself and having ownership of your education as you go through. The trick in this process, and one of the interesting outcomes that came from the design experience, was this idea of having almost a machine learning algorithm or a learning algorithm to say, hey, I come into the university at this point, and at that point, which is where my hands are right here, at that point, I'm probably being influenced by myself, being influenced by my community, influenced maybe by my parents relative to what I should start with. So, you know, my parents said, hey, well, you should be an engineer. And I'm like, okay, I'll be an engineer, right? That kind of thing. And then over time, you realize, you know, through your experiences, maybe I should be something else. Maybe I want to be something else. Maybe I have aspirational goals to be something else, right? And so having a support structure that allows you to engage into the university in a palatable way, but providing almost like real-time feedback to say, well, maybe I want to go in this direction, but in an efficient way to find your path to termination or to graduation, most importantly. And so this was Modular University, and once again, Kristen was the primary persona.
And just to add to that, there are some students that have been saying they are building their modular own major based on what their future career is going to be. So they're going out to their companies who they want to work for, saying which pieces of which classes do you think are going to be best for me, and then they're compiling it back into their own major, which is a modular type of major. And so this kind of anecdotal stuff is what partly drove our
Yep.
persona creation is recognizing, oh yeah, that works really well for what Will just said. Then I would say, oh, I know a whole bunch of students doing this too. And that was what helped drive and create the
Yep.
personas.
And this is an interesting example, just to add to that, is where students can actually drive outcomes if they're being empowered, right? So I think, just culturally where we are with, I think, especially traditional students that are coming into the institution at Boise State and do have this sense of uh, empowerment and sense of ownership of their future, and then social engagement, are really wanting to parcel out what their future could look like and taking more stake in that process. That will drive the institution to provide that as a resource, which is nice. We are now on slide 5,
5.
which is the global university. And this is an aspirational goal for Boise State. You could think about, on one hand, what would be the implications of not having a bricks and mortar institution at all? What happens if we stop building buildings and we stopped purchasing land as a state institution, which is a common trend, and instead we actually just leased land in a whole host of places across the world? A good example is maybe I'm a student within a cohort of about 15 to 20 students. I end up going to London. I go to the London School of Economics, and I take a class in real time from John Eccleton, who is a parental figure in the triple bottom line. For whatever reason, he's spending time there as a resident. And you get the exposure to a internationally recognized individual, and then in addition, your tuition dollars are being directly paid to ensure the quality control of the courses that are being provided. So there's a minimization for the overhead that sometimes is afforded to a lot of other institutions or a lot of state institutions on keeping the lights on, paying for the football team, all these other kinds of things, right? That can happen. Now, when I go into my first cohort, let's say in London, then a subset of that cohort would then transfer and go to Hong Kong. And maybe I'm learning international business in Hong Kong, and I'm spending approximately, let's say, 7 months there within a subset of my cohort, which I've built relationships with, but now I have a new professor, right? Then I hop over to Rome. Within Rome, I'm maybe learning about architecture and building civilizations, and the correlation between design and humanity is a very elegant connection that can be made. But nonetheless, there would be a distribution of nodes globally, all focused on what are iconic urban environments, culturally very distinct, that is promoting a sense of global citizenship among the population. You would be able to participate throughout your time, 4 years, up to 7 cities, if you will, you would engage, of which a population of your cohort would move from one to the next. And it would be effectively leasing space at the world's greatest locations, and also having the home base of here at Boise State University, which has an attraction. So you could actually have an onboarding process for coaching before deployment, almost like a mission mentality, where everybody gets trained for what it will look like, how to be prepared, how to be supportive in the process, how to be resilient through the process, but then concurrently how to lean forward to capitalize on the opportunity. So this is Global University, and got to go to the end on it.
Well, I know that this is the one that's more of a stretch for Boise State than the others, which are closely attainable. But are there other universities out there doing this now?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Amy. There's a small and growing startup in California called Minerva that actually does this very well, and it's, I think, starting to challenge a lot of private institutions in terms of what does study abroad look like, because study abroad could be a semester experience, and it's moved at a national level, if not carefully managed by the institution, as a check box, if you will, for students that are looking for upward mobility. So they go, they get the experience, they're like, hey, that was great, I put it on my resume, I had a lot of fun, but the depth and breadth of learning that is occurring sometimes can be under question, and the quality control can be under question as well. And so Minerva has struck out and said, we're going to creating a lead experience for a subset of applicants, and the application process is kind of interesting, but you apply and you end up actually visiting a series of rented spaces under the Minerva initiative. And so it's a real thing, and it's, I think, challenging a lot of higher ed right now in a positive way. So.
What's really exciting about this to me is that it's applying the user experience principles and design thinking experience to the university system, which can only benefit all of the students. So now we're ready to introduce who we were thinking about, right?
Yes, right.
Then let's start with Joaquin. And I've also sent a link in the chat, the group chat, that goes directly to a place where you can all download these personas as well, and you can follow along and take a look at them. I mostly put them in this environment here on Selected Works, just so you have some context, and others are using these on campus. So the design of a persona is really time intensive, as I know Will knows now, but we had spent a couple years working on the library ones, and I'm glad that they're finding new purposes all over campus, which is really great. Are we ready to talk about them?
Yeah.
How we came about them? So Joaquin is first. I think it's really important for you guys to know that we were looking at this from trying to be inclusive as possible and incorporate as diverse viewpoints as possible. We both have different kinds of blinders. And I think probably both of us combined also even have a blinder that we haven't necessarily exposed when we were in the design process of these personas. But Joaquin, I feel like, is the student that I encounter the most in the Maker Lab. This is the most popular market segment that the Maker Lab attracts. They're super upwardly mobile. They know exactly what they want to be doing when they graduate, and their jobs that haven't necessarily been created yet, but they're trying to create this area for them. They've had a lot of support. Their parents are very supportive. They've had a lot of opportunities already. In this case, Joaquin is a sophomore mechanical engineering major, and his parents come and visit, and they take he and his friends out for dinner on the weekends. They love it. They're from Seattle. He had a 3D printer in his high school, which is something that not a lot of Idaho students have access to, but it's something they've come to expect when they come to Boise State. They've come to expect that there's going to be all of these things ready for them. They're working on their own intellectual property, so they're trying to figure out how they can start their own business to do what it is that they want to do. So if you're looking at Joaquin, the inventor, he's got like a million side projects, right?
Yes.
What else do we want to say about Joaquin here?
So another thing is that Joaquin is targeted. So he's coming out of the Seattle area, and so for Boise State, we do strategic recruitment from Seattle and as well as Southern California. And there's a tendency for both parents to be employed, typically in a tech-based industry. There's a lot of upward mobility that's afforded. There's also this movement and educational orientation, maybe familiar with design thinking at an early stage, right? As a consequence, Joaquin has aspirational goals, right? But is also running into some of the conflicts associated with the institution, like the institution not necessarily being primed for Joaquin, right?
The major that he wants doesn't exist,
Right.
Essentially. It's
Exactly.
not here, so he's forced to kind of build something that works for him.
Right.
And since he's making those kinds of choices, he's also someone who's not super into theory. He's a really hands-on individual.
Yes.
And so that might hinder him in the future. So how do we help him to get a better variety of classes so that it's not just going to be hands-on?
Right. And on that front, based on all that priming, all that experience, you can envision Joaquin coming into the institution, but also actually navigating to find community, right? So he's in mechanical engineering. There's a lot of theory involved in mechanical engineering. He's struggling with the theory. He's looking for more aspirational goals, but culturally he's not finding the fit. And so he's actually navigating the system almost at risk of being independent or a loner if we're not careful. So
there's a question, you have anecdotal evidence supporting these persona characteristics, and based on my experiences in the library, what other data support them? So what was interesting, if I can jump in,
Yep.
let you answer too,
Yep.
what was very different about this persona design as compared to the library personas is that these had a different type of data. This was more qualitative rather than quantitative. The personas had to resonate with all of the people in attendance at the Vision 2020. We wanted all of the attendees to look at these and say, hey, I recognize that person. Oh, I've met Joaquin before. I know exactly who you're talking about when you say Joaquin. And so what was more important was that based on the stories that I've heard, that Will's heard, and others, we were trying to compile it together as anecdotal evidence instead of quantitative. Right?
And then, absolutely, and I think for both Amy and I, each one of the personas, and using Joaquin as an example, represents a multitude of students for each of us. So it's a compilation that's occurring. One of the
about
key,
20 or so,
yeah,
right?
about 20 students for each of us, and so this. There was a need, and I think had positive outcomes, to have an emotional response relative to our audience. So for example, the language used, the recruited student, was very strategic. That's strategic because we had administrators that were actually involved in recruitment of students that participated in Boise State 2020, specifically that had gone on road shows to Seattle to actually recruit students just like Joaquin, as an example, right? So although anecdotal, it was being pulled from a lot of experiences that Amy has here in the library and at the university at large. And then relative to me, I taught 1,000 students in my time, probably more, here at Boise State. And we did our best to embody a segment of the market for each one of these, I guess is how I would share it.
Do you feel like we focused on students that were struggling more with the system than students that were just fine with the way the system works? Just a reflective question that I only just realized now. I wonder if we had a bias in that way. If we were the traditional four-year university. I don't know. I think there are some who we did capture that are just fine with the way it is.
Yeah,
but
there's one in particular, and for me, I tried to think about cultural, structural, and personal barriers that our students confront when driving conversations with Amy. Some of which tend to be more personal. Right? We have some that had very high personal loads, and that speaks to a lot of people on campus. Then we had some that, like Joaquin, I think is more of a structural issue. The institution wasn't necessarily ready for Joaquin, right? We're doing our best and we're trying to play catch up, right, in many ways. But then there's also cultural ones that come to play that are a mixture between personal and structural. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that makes sense. Yeah, I'm just recalling all of those conversations now. And it's exactly what we were talking about. Katie is really similar. Steve, if you could drive the persona document to Katie, I feel like Katie has a little bit in common with Joaquin, but not a whole, not entirely. She's also really ambitious. She's a marketing major with some theater minor. She is from Idaho, right?
Yes. Yeah, she's a Boise native, Boise High School.
Boise High.
Yep.
Yeah. So she really was encouraged to be a part of the community by her parents, and they're very involved in the Boise community as well. So she kind of grew up knowing this is kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a part of this community. She's really great at networking. As a result, her focus is to go work in New York City as working for a theater company when she graduates. She doesn't exactly know how she's going to do that. She's just going to try. And she's super ambitious, so she'll help you by saying, I need a letter of recommendation for this scholarship or this opportunity. I can draft this letter for you. So she understands the needs of other people around her. So she had really clear ambitions, like it says on her little bullet points down below, but she's also super overextended. There's this element where there are many, many, many side projects that she is working on, and she'll say yes to lots of things because she thinks it'll help her get to where she wants to go. So Katie, where did we have her in terms of the futures? I'm blanking on this right now.
I am too. No, it's okay.
Which one was she? Was she the global university? She might have been global.
I'd have to go back and check.
Okay.
It would be a good fit.
I think that was one of the ones we had chosen for her. But global would have fit in with lots of different personas. Should we skip? Do you want to say more about Katie?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, there's this element of homegrown. So she's referred to as the homegrown student. And our homegrown students at Boise State, I would put against any students. We have just recently announced a Marshall Scholar, for example. That's a homegrown student that has gone through. It's not uncommon to have McNair fellows that go on and do amazing things and so forth. This happens at all institutions. You find great people everywhere is what it comes down to. This element associated with going to a local high school is interesting too, because there is a bias for faculty spouses to teach at the high school. There's also a very vibrant campus. It's an open campus, so the students are able to go and come out of lunch and actually leave campus, go wherever they want, come back. There's a very strong art scene, cultural scene. There's cultural heritage that's embedded into the curriculum. And so it's quite progressive as a consequence. Also, many of these students, Katie included, could have gone to a lot of other schools. Okay, for whatever reason, Katie chose to go to Boise State, but she likely had scholarships to go elsewhere, but the scholarships were probably not high enough to justify the cost, you know. So she maybe got, $20,000, but it's still a $65,000, check to go to Duke or whatever it is. Boise State was reasonable, financially stable, and her and her family recognized that the growing imperative on the burden associated with taking out loans, right?
Because she did concurrent enrollment, also she was really prepared for coming here because she already knew a lot of the expectations that were going to come along with that, which we see all the time.
And so it's like this fluid transition right into Boise State. This element of overextension, though, is also something that among students that have been really primed for success, very engaged, have very supportive communities, very ambitious, outgoing, and so forth. They're doing a million things, right? And we see this in a subset of our population, and they're at risk of, I sometimes say, bonking from running, long distance running, but they're at risk of dropping a lot of things at once. So Katie, she's well put together, she's organized, she's thoughtful, she's on point, she's leading, she's following, she's engaged, right? She's the captain of her lacrosse team. She's got just a million things going on. You're like, how are you doing this, Katie? Right? And institutionally, sometimes we're actually not supporting Katie to manage that type of expectation, nor coaching on how to set appropriate expectations to prevent burnout.
And I think in some of those cases, the students take semesters off. I think from what I've heard.
Yeah, they get burnt out.
Yeah. Yep. That's what happens.
So,
Steve, if you would scroll, because I still can't control Fuse, to Kristen. She's the tech savvy and determined member. Kristen was one of the working university futures that we had selected. Yep. And Kristen came out after we had already put together the personas. So we had put together a whole group of personas and we were working on them, and I realized we were missing this person who wasn't being supported. They didn't already have this home. So like Katie and Joaquin, where there's a lot of family support and there's financial support and their parents have already gone to college, there wasn't necessarily representation of someone who had ambitions and was really smart, but came from a low-income family and didn't have the same kinds of support structures in place. How do we design a university for this type of student? And so her parents did value education. They took her to museums and libraries when she was a child. Her teachers recognized her as being incredibly intelligent. She wants to make a big impact, and she's starting to kind of recognize that she herself can make these kinds of changes in the world around her, that she's very talented. So part of the reason that the working university was a really good fit for her was that she's always going to be working while she is on campus. So she's going to have a part-time job, and in her part-time job, she's not going to work on campus because she can't make enough money on campus, so she has to work off campus. And in that off-campus environment, her supervisors are going to find that she's incredibly talented, and they're going to try to promote her. So there becomes the struggle between the campus and work life, where she's starting to make a lot of money. She can maybe keep advancing in her career, but she still really wants to get her degree. That becomes a balancing issue for a lot of our students. So she's not as engaged on campus as we want her to be.
Right.
You want to say more
Yep,
here on
yep.
Kristen?
There's also this, she's referred to as the first generation student, which we have a lot at Boise State. And so what does that mean if you unpackage it a little bit? It means that likely your community and your family may not uh, know how to provide advice on how to navigate the system. There may be a push for you to move forward in life and a lot of pride, but not necessarily the best advice on how to do so. And as a consequence, uh, uh, she has engaged into the university and has a component that could be a little bit isolating. She doesn't know how to sign up for classes. She doesn't know how to choose a major. She doesn't know necessarily how to reach out to faculty in a way with a resume to get into their labs to do research, as an example.
And she won't ask questions about it either.
Right. No,
Yeah.
no.
Right.
There's reservation and there's pride. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's a combination, especially if she's Idahoan in a positive way. And so, there are barriers for her to get pulled through the system, and she's very much going to do her best to push herself through the system at odds with this needing to support herself financially with an off-campus job, which many students do. So
There's a
yeah.
comment from, I think, Steve, that each persona has a set of these characteristics that link them to each scenario, but they have some kind of brewing crisis. What's in it for me? Interest in the future university. And I think that's true. I
Yep.
think that for almost every undergraduate we run into, I don't know a single undergraduate who's like, I've got this.
Yeah, right. Right.
I'm doing great.
There's also this part that if we presented personas that everything was uh, very polished
Right,
and
right.
very and only positive. I mean, these are positive people, engaged people, but if we weren't highlighting the reality to the best of our ability, there would be nothing to work on for Boise State 2020.
Yeah, Steve taught me that too with the design of personas. If I can just tag back to the whole training part, you can kill off a persona if they're not going to be useful to you. So if we had designed personas that didn't have some kind of brewing crisis, they wouldn't have been useful
Yeah, exactly.
in the design of a future university.
Yeah.
And I hate to use the term kill off because I've like grown attached to these people over time. So I don't want to kill off any of them. We have a great crew of
Right.
personas.
We can use them elsewhere. There's other experiences.
Yes. But in the library personas I've designed, I have killed some off.
Yep.
Some people refer to that as cryogenic suspension.
Okay,
Yeah,
I can
right.
switch my language and it'll feel nicer somehow.
So the process here is starting with these large-scale scenarios describing what the literature is showing could be these different futures for universities in general and Boise State in particular. And then based on those scenarios, driving into the creation of these personas that are tools for tying into and exploring those potential futures.
Absolutely. So each one of these personas, so everyone that participated, whether they were faculty, administration, we had some external participants also in order to create a little bit of velocity for the event, as well as salted in or feathered in student participation. But everybody came in and everybody was by first name only. And everyone was a student. And every student had to create or every team representing an individual student or an individual persona had to create a signature experience for that future university. And that's where the outcome started to happen. And we can for sure share more about that.
So think about it like university plus student in these representations equals package. They were essentially designing some kind of package. And just for more framing, there were a couple warm-up exercises, if I can call them that, before they got to the final design process.
Yeah.
And so the personas end up being the people who are going to be involved in the key experience that a team later designs as a prototype, future university.
Right.
Yes.
Right. You ready to skip on to Nora, family first? She's our international Saudi student.
We have her.
This was the one we debated about probably, I feel like we had the most interesting discussions about Nora. we had very divergent experiences with the Saudi and international student populations, both Will and I, coming from different disciplines. This is a great place. Also, the female Saudi student is a really underrepresented voice. And this was something I've had a lot of direct experience with and had one experience, and then Will has had completely different experiences. So in her case, a family and the culture.
And can you
Yes.
share from yours, and then I'll come from
Sure,
mine? Yeah,
sure.
right. Okay.
For whatever reason, here in the library, we work with large groups of international students. The library is their home, and a lot of them will work together to select and volunteer one person to go up and ask the librarian a question. So they'll sacrifice one person to ask the question in English and then come back and discuss it amongst the 25 or so students working on a project, what the librarian meant when she said blah or when he said something else. And over that time, I've gotten to know a lot of the female students as well here who spend their time working in the library, and they've had experiences where they want to drop out of Boise State. Their family is so important to them and have put so many pressures on them that they're being forced to get A's, graduate with certain degrees, graduate in a certain number of semesters. Their government is sponsoring them, so they only have maybe 3 semesters to spend to get their certificate in something, which has led to some serious emotional crises. And that's where I encounter them, is they're having this huge breakdown. They're going to quit being at Boise State and they're going on to the next university.
Mhm.
So those are the kinds of experiences that I've had.
Okay. And so my experiences are both discrete within the College of Engineering, and then also just participating at a university-wide effort on how to support Saudi students specifically in a more robust way, and then also acknowledging and engaging on a cheating ring that was percolating among the population. So a lot of these, actually all of the students are being sponsored to come to Boise State. Their entrance qualifications are um, in some cases borderline, okay? And the challenge institutionally is that we weren't necessarily prepared to provide the support structure to move them through some of these early stage courses,
Right.
okay? And so I teach a course with about 120 students in it. It's a engineering class, and it's very common for one student to be to represent the group, if you will. It tends to be a male student. The student tends to come forward and is the negotiator. Combative conversation on grades, point assignments. If there is a cheating incident, sometimes it can be mapped to that individual. So it can be a very volatile situation at times. Okay. Now there's others within the class too that have reached out and shared examples of, listen, this is occurring and I'm trying to actually pull myself away from that type of activity, which can be very isolating from a cultural standpoint. And there's a pressure that gets fed back to the families, which is something that Amy had picked up on too, where it goes back to the families, then the families
Right.
report to the other family, then that family contacts their child
Right.
and applies an
So-
interesting form of pressure.
Why are you doing this?
Yes.
So in this case, Nora's friends would have said, oh, Nora is doing this. So Muhammad, her friend Muhammad, would have told his parents would have told Nora's parents,
Yep.
and Nora would have heard she's doing something through the grapevine that would be greatly exaggerated.
Exactly.
Increases the pressure.
And some of the cultural norms of their community are being appropriately, or I'm not. It's an interesting gray area, are being exported to the individuals within the context of Boise State. And so, as a faculty, we hear a lot about the males coming forward. And so, initially, I started to draft and to think in terms of an international student being a Saudi student that was a male, and then. For Amy, she said, well, I'm engaging with many females, right? And all of a sudden we kind of struck and we said, hey, this is not a voice that's actually heard on campus very often, because at large, I think for the Boise State 2020 event, for most of the administration, at least that I had engaged with, there was a tone that, not that the males were the problem or anything like that, but they were taking most of the oxygen in the room in terms of conversations and engagement and leaning forward. So it was underrepresented voice that we clearly needed to showcase.
I think this divergent experience too really exemplifies the reason you want to use personas in the first place, is that you're going to take your understanding, your personal biases based on your experiences with a group of people, and by working together, having more than one person work on the personas, you're going to expose any hidden biases or explicit biases that you may have, and in turn develop empathy. So the whole purpose behind the personas is to cultivate empathy, which will then inform the design process. So it's going to help you design better. So you're going to say, I'm trying to help support, I'm providing scaffolding essentially for this person's motivations, their experiences, and what they ideally want to have happen. Which potential university future is Nora's? I know we had said that global was one, but I think it was mastery. Is it mastery that we were hoping that she was going to exemplify? Which we didn't talk about all of the futures. Integrated was one. Was she RD&E? She might have been the RD&E one because of the fact that she had to obtain mastery to go back. She wanted to make a huge change.
Yeah, mastery,
Okay,
which she was the lead for.
great. Yeah.
And I think that for the orientation for her being the premier student or the lead student for a mastery university, which is you're building a competency skill, is that many of these students are actually being sponsored to get a very specific skill that's of direct need in correlation to going back to Saudi Arabia. So we see a lot that have a propensity for civil engineering, mechanical engineering. We also see a propensity for business.
Right.
And so this is a strategic decision process that's happening at a national level and are wanting skills above all in some cases.
I want to be sensitive to time and I don't want to go over. So I'm hoping we can close out talking about the personas and just move on to the question that we have, if that's okay. How did the personas shape the event? So how did the persona choices that we chose drive the conversation? Because Will is putting together a report. He's put the report together, but I haven't seen it yet. So this is kind of a surprise conversation. But from my point of view, it seems like a lot of the faculty discussions were so empathetic and they seemed to care so much about the potential future that they had driven. And occasionally as I was walking around the room, I would say, do you really believe in this prototype that you've put together? And a lot of times they'd say yes. I'd say, well, would you do it? Would you actually try to make this happen? And they'd be like, well, yeah, I totally believe in this prototype I developed.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. So as far as how did the personas shape the event, I think that they defined the event. They established number one, empathy for everybody that was participating. Everyone that was participating was busy. And there had to be a very quick conditioning experience or experiences to change their mindset so that we could get to the good stuff quickly. There was also a part of the event where a few emails were sent out. We had 84 participants across campus. The demand was very high, but everybody was selected to engage. And we had some folks that were believers of design thinking and believers of the future of Boise State and had already offered ideas on what that could be like.
Before coming to the event.
Before coming to the event, and they would be quick to take on personas, right, through that design process. We had others that were a little bit more on the calcified side. Mm-hmm. So I would say 80% of the population or the group was biased for interest, of which 20% was biased towards action.
Right.
Then we had the remaining 20% was probably reluctantly engaging, honestly.
Right.
As soon as you have someone take on a persona that feels real to them, okay. And here's another thing is that they got to choose their persona in some ways.
They mixed and matched them. We didn't tell them who was best suited to which. I don't think. No. I think they had to choose based on the persona and the university future they wanted to establish.
And the consequence for the event is that you're unarming or disarming people, and the emotional baggage that they may be bringing to an event, mm-hmm. which happens for all of us, right? But all of a sudden, it's like you give a focal point on, I am this person, right? And most importantly, if the persona is designed well, I can actually feel this person. I can see this person. I actually know this person. I know all these people,
Right,
right?
right.
Which is why we talk about them and why it's actually catching on. And other people are talking about them institutionally now. But I think that it provided identity, values, purpose, as well as velocity to the event. So,
I'm going to admit my personal bias is that I can never remember Paul's name until today. I've been working really hard on it, but this definitely helped me. Paul is he is from Kamei and he plays a lot of sports, which is definitely a blinder that I have. I'm completely unengaged with the part of our student population that plays sports. And so it's something I need to work on. So through this process also, it's helped me elucidate what I need to work on and who I need to focus on helping engage.
and I think that was happening too in the event. Like Amy and I were circulating around all the tables, engaging, participating, help move teams through the design experience for themselves to create that signature experience, if you will, for that future, adopting those personas. And I on more than one occasion, ran into tension between people.
Right.
Not them wearing their personal hats, but they're wearing their personas. They were having troubles moving forward in terms of what that design should and could be like. And a benefit of this, and a benefit for Amy and I, is you try to, of course, be self-aware of your blind spots, but it highlights them, right? And then all of a sudden now I refer to Nora all the time, right? And now more and more administrators are referring to Nora as an example, right? They're picking up the personas that we've created as a way of thinking about intentionally designing the products that they're trying to move forward, which I think that's an outcome, but it's definitely a consequence of shaping the event through the personas.
In the library, we like to say that every decision we make is going to benefit the users somehow. And so we want to think about all of our personas in terms of those decisions. So we're making the best possible decisions for the users, not based on what's easiest for me, though I'm sure that's important too.
Mm-hmm.
But when I make the decision to make sure it meets what my users want.
So,
57 after. Yeah, Steve, take it away.
I guess when I think about organizations trying to do strategic planning, there's some inherent risks. One risk is that the futures that people envision can be very, very abstract. And the problem with that degree of abstractness is, we can use even the same terms, but in our minds, those terms have very, very different meanings. And one of the neat things about what happened here with the personas, and then asking people at the 2020 event to begin designing university experiences for those personas, is that you're planning for the future, but removing some of that abstractness.
Mm-hmm.
And the second big risk with strategic planning is that lots of times it's an activity that leaders get to do. They do it differentially well, and then it's handed to everybody else, and everyone else is supposed to lockstep march off to this grand and glorious future together. And it seems that your use of personas and then designing university experiences for the personas also makes this a more democratic process and engenders more buy-in.
Yes.
Do I have this take on risk mitigation right?
You do, and then there's an added layer to it as well. Is in addition to a democratic engagement and participation, and equality of voice regardless of background, everybody by first name is really important. Distillation of the outcomes, is been going on. There's also this part of, when we're thinking about strategic planning, a lot of times I think institutionally or organizationally, it's a point in time. We do it, and then we are imposed to execute it, right? This is actually a diffuse starting and ending date. It's a continuum, right? And so we will revisit this, and it'll find its way into other things that are occurring on and off campus. But it doesn't set the expectation that on today we are going to have a new strategic decision for the university. That's not the case. the case is to percolate enough of a engagement where the culture starts to buy in as well as lean in to what we should and could become, and we start to move in that direction at a collective level.
Before we wrap this up, can I also say the persona design didn't happen overnight. You don't get to persona design overnight. This is something that I've worked on a great deal. And I first worked with Steve. I spent a few hours with him and the team in the library working on development of personas. And that kind of data was all qualitative, or quantitative rather, which is very different from the design for these personas for university wide. Each time you design, you're going to have a different target and a different scope and a different set of parameters that you're going to use to create the personas. It's the way that you approach the personas that's going to make them as valuable as possible. So thinking about the environment that you're working in, thinking about who it is that you're trying to reach, and the scope of what you're trying to hit. Those are the most important constraints. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen overnight. And I asked Steve a lot of questions when we first got started using personas. So he helped me with a crash course in this. And I just wanted to say, this has been invaluable for us in our work here at the library. And I'm really thrilled that I got to help see it grow to a university level.
So thanks, Steve.
Oh, my pleasure, and all shucks. I do think that one thing you said that struck me is with typical strategic planning approaches, that third risk of, oh yeah, on such and such a date, we launch the new vision and everyone goes live, is probably a pretty widespread misconception. And there are lots and lots of horror stories associated with that. And I think the ability to be able to organically grow this future as part of a ongoing dialogue is important, and getting that bottom up support is very important. Out of curiosity, I think change models would also indicate that you need, in addition to bottom up support, top down support from university leadership. What's going on that front in terms of using the personas and the prototypes that have been created to date?
Yep. So one of the intentional desired outcomes for Boise State 2020 is the movement and release of a request for proposals institutionally, and really with leaning forward, not necessarily specifically to the futures that were cast, but in some ways catalyzed by the experience on new degrees, new pathways of learning, and so forth. That is rolling, and hopefully will be announced relatively soon. What's happened since then is been using the derivatives or the some of the outcomes of Boise State 2020 as building a case to our leadership on why, number one, we should do this again, and number two, the level of investment that should be made into the institution on the types of bets we want to take. And so I have a series of outcomes where we have new degrees. There's one, professional anthropology, which may be of interest to you, Steve, that's being led by John Zeiker. I could talk to you more about it later. But we have new degrees that people are starting to lean forward in. And the best part is that they're actually not waiting for a call to do that. They're not waiting for signaling to lean forward in the process. There's self-confidence and engagement where faculty and administration are just saying, hey, I really want to do this in collaboration with CID or with, on behalf of Boise State University. And I have a bunch of outcomes that I could describe, but that is leading to the level of financial investment that the institution, or the bets, the number and the volume, or the size of the bets that the institution will be making going forward. And so we're working towards a request for proposals. The best part is that that's already biased for success. So
Chester asked an awesome question. I feel like I can answer. Do you have any issues with people outside the team taking personas seriously? And if so, how did you overcome their skepticism? Absolutely. So when I first started doing this was 2 years ago in the library, I think someone said, well, you just made all that up. But that's where the citations really help, because there's data to back up every single persona that the library has created and every single persona that we've created. Having those kinds of citations included in the persona design is critical to being taken seriously. And I think over time, you gradually can develop a process of inclusion to teach people, here's a persona and here's a journey map. Here's the task that we're trying to help people meet, whatever that task may be, whether it's in business or in libraries, universities. How do you help that persona go on their journey? Where are the pain points that they run into? And then how do you change them from, instead of being pain points, happy experiences if you have control over them? And basically, it's come down to a lot of instructional assistance and teaching people slowly and gradually throughout the entire organization how to use them, and hopefully tie some of those to the strategic plan, if there is one, or any key performance indicators, if there are some. So you can try to affect the metrics eventually to show how this is going to impact your organization positively. I think that's the direction that we're heading now.
You know, there's part of it where you're defending yourself through data, right? And you're defending yourself through architecture, but you're also defending yourself with the emotional response that you can draw from the audience. And so being aware of the conversations that are occurring in the group that you're engaging drives, it's like there are key sentences in each one of these. I mean, we line picked, word picked. I mean, at the end, it was like word by word. Amy and I sat next to one another. What is your interpretation? Who's this going to hit? Like those types of engagements. I think if you can draw an emotional response, you have natural buy-in. And so the imagery that's used is intentional. The orchestration or the scaffolding is intentional, which helps kind of alignment. But really, the story, I think, has an emotional component that many people on campus talk about and are aware of, and we're just highlighting it and making it even more acute. You're elevating that emotion to the forefront.
It's almost like you're saying that the design of the personas, the intention that goes into their design is going to then help translate and impact the design that you're using them for.
Yes.
And the more detail that you put into that, the better off it's going to be. The more positive decisions that you make in terms of the design of the persona, that will impact positively continuing out.
Yep, right.
And one trick for doing both of these, the citations and, building the organizational street cred, I learned from one of my students is to use the footnote feature. And so every little characteristic has an associated footnote where you're specifying either a working assumption that you're drawing on or specific qualitative quantitative data. And in those hard meetings where people aren't taking those seriously, you review both the personas and the footnotes together. So everyone there walks out of that meeting saying, yes, these are the personas we're using. These are the assumptions underlying those personas, the data underlying those personas, and we agree that these personas are reasonable tools.
Yes. Something just popped in my head too, Steve, that didn't happen at Boise State 2020, but has happened in the past when I've engaged in opportunities like this before, is having almost like a roll call of people. I've done something not exactly the same, but in California when I was a faculty, and it's like I can lean in on the table, and if you know your colleagues, you can say, we know students like this, right? I mean, how about so-and-so? And you can make that correlation. And you can, if they're having troubles making that jump, I guess, you can make the jump for them. And then you only have to do it once. And then everybody at the table ends up kind of changing their orientation and their sincerity in the engagement process.
I like that.
So you promote a state of accountability to say, no, these are real people, right? But not in a public setting, right? It's at an individual level.
I'd like to Thank you both very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
This, folks, this is the end of our webinar. Thank you for attending. Thank you very much for being here. Goodbye now.
Thank you.